And today we are broaching a very, very important topic, researcher mental health and work-life balance post-COVID. And before we get to our speakers, I'm going to turn us over to Dr. Steve Finkley, the Acting Director of the Office of Science, for a brief introduction and welcome. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, Susanna, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And also, I'd like to thank all the participants that have called in on the Zoom. As Susanna said, this is really an important activity for us. So I'll be brief. The DOE National Laboratories lead the world in science at scale and in operating national user facilities. As the laboratory complex enters its 8th decade, vestiges of its World War II roots remain. To ensure that the laboratories have the resources and structures needed to thrive for many decades to come, we are working to create a vision for the laboratories of the future. The overarching question we are posing as part of this exercise is, what would the DOE National Labs be like if we had the power to make them any way that we wanted? Embedded in this question is the recognition that the DOE labs are widely regarded as unique resources that year after year produce groundbreaking research, a reputation that must be preserved. Starting last year, we have been reaching out to former DOE and lab leadership, current DOE and lab leadership, early career researchers at the labs, external stakeholders, scientific professional societies, industrial partners, international partners, and more. We are also holding workshops such as this as a way to share the ideas that we have been collecting. As Susanna mentioned, we held the first 3 workshops in the fall of 2020, and we are continuing this process today. We also plan to have workshops on collaboration models, especially important in a virtual environment and research flexibility. And so at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Susanna and get the workshop underway.
Excellent.
Over to you, Susanna.
Thank you. So now I will try and advance my slides. Here we go. This is just the introduction to Labs of the Future that Steve covered. And I will go to our first speakers, Ms. Clorinda Cerejo and Ms. Andrea Hayward, both from Cactus Communications, and they're going to talk about their global survey on mental health among researchers. Just quick bios. Clorinda is currently the Senior Director of Thought Leadership at Cactus Communications, where she's responsible for delivering content that brings about positive changes in research culture and the way research is communicated and consumed globally, both in academia and industry. She first joined Cactus Communications in 2006 and holds a Master of Science in Biotechnology from the University of Mumbai. And Ms. Andrea Hayward currently works in the community engagement team at Cactus Communications. She is also one of the hosts of Our Voice, a digital community that empowers researchers to connect, share, support, and grow. Prior to her current role, Ms. Hayward was a project manager on the Cactus Mental Health Survey, a global survey conducted by Cactus Communications on the mental health and well-being of researchers. And I will turn it over to the 2 of them to hear about their work.
Okay, I'm just going to start by sharing my screen and then Clorinda will take over. Clorinda, you're on mute.
Thanks, Andrea, and hello, everyone, and thanks for being here today. And it's a pleasure for me and Andrea to be here as well. The 2 of us are going to be talking about highlights from a global survey, the first of its kind that's been done at this larger scale among researchers globally. So since Susanna already kind of gave an introduction to us, Andrea, you can move. I'll just move really quickly. But essentially, I have over 15 years experience working in the scholarly communication space, essentially working to help researchers achieve success in various aspects of their life, right from getting published to work-life balance and mental health, and just support to researchers in various ways. I used to be the editor-in-chief, and I helped build out a platform called Heritage Insights, which is a global resource platform for researchers available in multiple languages. And it was where the birth of this entire project of a mental health survey for researchers sort of came to life. And a lot of my work involves research around what could make researchers happier, overcome challenges they face with publication, especially researchers from non-native English speaking countries, and then researchers globally who don't necessarily have access to all the resources that some other more privileged researchers might. And I'll allow Andrea to introduce herself.
Thanks, Lorinda. So I'll be brief because Susanna told you most of what you need to know about me. I just want to point out that for this project, the Cactus Mental Health Survey, I've been working on it for a little over a year and a half now. And I've been managing all of the related activities and initiatives that have come out from the survey. And a large part of what we do as an offshoot of the survey is actually workshops and webinars like these, where we're constantly trying to talk about research on mental health and well-being and take that conversation forward to ensure that the kind of situation that we have now is constantly improving, and that we have a more positive research culture and work environment for researchers.
Thanks, Andrea. So a really quick snapshot of Cactus Communications. Cactus Communications is a global science communication company that's driven by technology. Like I mentioned, we help support researchers at all stages of their career and life. We offer services like language editing, publication support, and post-publication support in impact. So impact communication, communicating research in a way that it's accessible to a larger community and to the public at large. We also have a technology-driven function that helps develop AI-based tools to help researchers at various stages of their publication journey. You can move, Andrea. So I'll just give you a brief introduction into this survey. It's called the Cactus Mental Health Survey. Basically, the platform called Heritage Insights that I mentioned earlier, on that platform, we invited researchers to start sharing their stories. And the reason we did that was that we wanted to see researchers beyond their publications, because that's what they're always known for or recognized for, and very rarely are they seen as people. And so we started inviting researchers to share their stories, and we realized that there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes in academic life, in researcher life, that is not, that needs a lot of attention that it doesn't get at the moment. So on the occasion of World Mental Health Day in 2019, we launched this survey. We ran it for about 10 months, and we launched the survey report, the first report, in October on World Mental Health Day 2020. We got over 13,000 respondents globally, and over 160 countries were represented. And the survey itself was a robust instrument that sort of talked to all aspects of researcher life, beyond, within and beyond their work space. Andrea, you can move. Yeah, and so to go a little deeper into why this survey, I think if many of you are probably researchers attending or have a good enough understanding of researchers, but there's a lot that people don't know in terms of, how often they face rejection being a pretty much regular feature in their lives, failure, and then having crazy things, crazy imposter syndrome, and a sense of just never being good enough. And they account for a really tiny population in the global scheme. Among the global population, it's like, just a percentage, but nothing has shown us more than the last couple of years how important they are and how hard they work for us, and the fact that we would be nowhere without researchers. And so it's really important that they get some of this focus. So while we wanted to get into what are the challenges researchers face, we also wanted to understand what makes some researchers thrive, and is that a factor of their environment, and if so, can that environment be replicated across other research institutions? So that was the purpose of this survey, and it aimed to find out what's working and what's not in the research culture, and how can the research culture be more nurturing in general. And now I'll turn over to Andrea to talk about more specifics about the survey and the results we got.
Thanks, Clarinda. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to focus on these specific themes that we covered in the survey. And through these themes, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the key findings. And it's going to help you understand the kind of pressures that researchers experience, both at work as an effect of work, and how this influences their mental health and well-being. And then towards the end, we'll get into what decision makers in academia can do to improve the current situation. All right, so before we talk about findings, let's talk about who in fact took the survey. So we'll talk about the global sample and specific data slices which will be relevant to present company. So as Clarinda mentioned, 13,000 researchers globally participated in the survey, and respondents based in the US at the time of taking the survey made up 9% of this total sample. So the survey was largely academia facing, but we did have respondents who self-identified as working in sectors such as government and industry. So 6% of the total global sample self-indicated that they were working in the government sector at the time of taking the survey. So the survey is called Joy and Stress Trigger. So we thought, why not start with the good stuff, start with the things start with those aspects of the survey that helped us explore what makes researchers love their job, what makes them feel passionate and strongly about it. So as you can see, 76% of the global sample agreed that their work gave them a sense of purpose and made them feel fulfilled, and almost half indicated that the academic environment they work in inspires them to work towards their research goals. Pretty encouraging findings, I feel personally. It's also important to note that 60% they agree that they enjoy the intellectual and creative challenges involved, and they look forward to their work every day. So even though we found that researchers did have positive things to say about their work and about their work environments, some of the findings were pretty alarming and have generated cause for concern. We'll start with work environments in research. So the main indicator of mental health in this survey was a question around how often respondents felt overwhelmed by their work situation. And as you can see, over 1/3 of the global sample agreed that they felt overwhelmed by their work situation fairly or very often. So we had a vast sample. So we thought it might be interesting to dig deeper and see if there was a variation by country. And we found there were a whole lot of countries that were above the global average of 38%. And if you see, respondents from the US are up here in the top 3, and they were more likely to state that they felt overwhelmed situation. So now we'll go into work-related pressures and relationships. But before we dive into specifics, I just wanted you to look at the major concern areas here. And most of these have to do with the work itself, or the amount of work, or to do with difficult relationships or trouble with the people who researchers are working with. All right, so we'll start with pressure to publish. I'm sure none of you are strangers to this topic. So 65% of the surveyed researchers agreed that they were under tremendous pressure to publish papers, secure grants, and complete projects. And as you can see on the screen, respondents from the government sector were less likely to agree with this as compared to respondents from academia. Another thing that we thought would be interesting to explore was the quality of relationships that researchers had with the people who they were working with. And we found that respondents based in the US were more likely to agree that they had difficult relationships with their subordinates, peers, collaborators, and supervisors as compared to the global sample. Coming to the topic of the hour, work-life balance. If you look at some of these statistics, it's almost half the sample, and it's really cause for concern. 43% of the global sample disagree that they had sufficient time for things like hobbies, recreation, spending time with family, and social activities. And respondents based in the US were more likely to disagree that they had time for such hobbies and recreational activities. A similar proportion of the global sample indicated that their organization didn't have effective policies to help them achieve a good work-life balance. I think it's very important here to see that only 8% of the 13,000 researchers strongly agreed that their organization did have such policies. And a lack of such policies to help them achieve a good work-life balance seemed to affect researchers' mental health. As you can see, 59% of the respondents who reported insufficient work-life balance policies, they were more likely to report feeling overwhelmed by their work situation as compared to respondents overall. We'll move forward to whether researchers feel valued, safe, and welcomed in academia and in their work environment. So before we dive into more specific details, I'll give you a minute to look at the major focus areas that the survey explored. All right. So one of the questions in the survey asked respondents whether they felt welcomed and included in their organization and by their peers, irrespective of factors like gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or social background. And 16% of the global sample disagreed that they feel welcome and included. And as you can see, respondents who are based in the US were more likely to disagree with this. Now, why have I focused on the smaller numbers is something that you could question me about. The reason is that even though these are small numbers, when you think about scale and when you think about the size of the sample, it's really, these numbers are really worrying. And another reason is that regardless of how many or how few people feel this way, feeling welcome and included is the bare minimum that you would expect from an organization. So it's important to think about why people out there are feeling this way and whether there's anyone who is thinking about how this can be stopped and how they can feel more welcome. Another question asked researchers if they had experienced any form of discrimination, harassment, or bullying in their work environment. And as you can see, a worryingly high proportion of the global sample indicated that they had indeed experienced such behavior in the workplace. And unfortunately, respondents based in the US, they were more likely to agree that they had experiences with such behaviors in the workplace. We'll move on to whether respondents thought that their organization had policies around such behaviors in the workplace. 36% of the global sample agreed that their organization was lacking in strict policies to prevent, detect, and take action against discrimination, harassment, or bullying in the workplace. And 66% of those who agreed that their organization was lacking in such strict policies, they reported having experienced discrimination, bullying at work. And as you can see from the third bullet point here, having experiences with such behaviors in the workplace seem to have an effect on respondents' mental health. So almost half of those who felt that their organization was lacking in such strict policies reported feeling frequently overwhelmed at work. Now we've talked about work itself and how that has had an effect, but for some of the respondents, there were a lot of wider concerns that seem to affect their overall well-being as well as their work pressures itself. So two of these areas were concerns about political developments affecting their ability to continue research in the country that they currently worked in. So we found that respondents based in the US were more likely to report being concerned about such political developments affecting their research. And this one is not really surprising, but respondents from the government sector were more likely to agree with this statement on political developments as compared to both the entire sample as well as respondents from academia. The graph on the left reflects the same finding that I was just speaking about. So I'll move on to the next. The other one had to do with developments or policies aside from the political ones that might negatively affect researchers' current and future research. And similar to the previous finding, we found that respondents based in the US were more likely to report feeling concerned about this. It's really interesting to think about whether these trends might be different now, given that the administration has recently undergone a change in the US. Moving on to whether researchers are willing or how open they feel about seeking help and support if they need it. Two things that we tried to cover here were how willing they were to discuss work-based feelings of severe stress and anxiety with relevant people in their workplace. And if in fact they were experiencing such feelings, were they willing to seek professional help to deal with them? So we found that respondents based in the US were more likely to indicate that they would not be comfortable having such discussions in the workplace. And immediately you think why? And the two most likely reasons for this are quite troubling. One was a fear that discussing such issues with someone from their organization would reflect poorly on them. And the second one is a feeling that such a situation was a normal part of academic life and that they should just get used to it. The next finding is slightly more encouraging, thankfully. So as compared to the global sample, we found that respondents in the US were more willing or had sought professional help in dealing with such feelings of severe stress or anxiety because of their situation at work. So we've spoken about the pressures, we've gone into the things that are happening that can be done better. So, but what can we do exactly and where do we start? So we asked researchers a very critical open question in the survey. We asked them what they felt stakeholders and decision makers in academia can do in order to create a better, more nurturing, more supportive work environment. And their comments, they were very detailed, open-ended comments, and we got over 5,000 of these. They indicated several issues that need to be addressed. I've listed a couple here. There are a lot more, and you can read those in our full survey report. But if you look closely at these suggestions for change that have come from the respondents themselves, you'll see that they're all closely related to some of the issues that we've been talking about in the previous slides. So, sorry. So if we're talking about prevention of behaviors like harassment, discrimination, and bullying at work, provision for psychological support and normalizing discussions around mental health, and better work-life balance or some work-life balance if that's missing completely. So I'm going to do my final comments as I let you hear from the survey respondents themselves. So I picked, there are a whole lot of comments that you can look at through our, through both the reports that we've released, but these ones really spoke to me and I felt that based on the topics that we discussed today, these would be most relevant. So I'll let you take a look at these and I'll just make my final comments. All right, I'm going to go back to the previous slide and I'll give you a little more time to look at these. So when we're talking about things like preventing harassment, discrimination, and bullying, it's easy to say, but what can institutions and organizations actually do? I think real change will come when they actually start taking an interest in building policies to prevent such behaviors and not just making policies, textbook policies. They need to involve people that might be at a higher risk of experiencing such behaviors in the workplace for whatever reason. I feel like these people might be more sensitive to certain vulnerabilities and certain weaknesses that the larger group might not be privy to. And so their involvement would really help with making sure that these policies which are being built are fit for purpose. Similarly, when it comes to provision of psychological support, a lot of researchers who participated, they were more likely to seek such support outside of the institution or the organization. So there seems to be a need for confidential spaces within the institution or supported access to such spaces outside of the institution, and just helping researchers understand that them talking about things like burnout, them talking about things like anxiety and depression is not taboo. It's just a part of life, and that their organization or institution is there to support them through it. Thank you so much for listening. It's been fantastic to be here. I'll add a link to our survey report in the chat. And yeah, please do download both reports. There's a lot more to read than what I spoke about today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction, really nicely set the stage and introduced the factors that undermine as well as support researcher mental health. So now we're going to augment this discussion by looking at how COVID has exacerbated this tension between work and life, mental health, and especially how that has impacted primary caregivers. So I'm pleased to introduce our next two speakers, which are Dr. Eve Higginbotham and Ms. Maria Lundahlberg. Maria is the study director for the consensus study on the science and effective mentoring in STEM for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and a program officer with the Board on Higher Education and Workforce and the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. She came to the National Academies by way of a Christine Mirzavan Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which she received after completing all the requirements short of finalizing the dissertation for her doctorate in physics at Penn State University. She holds a BA with high honors in physics from Vassar College and an MS in physics from Penn State University. Dr. Eve Higginbotham is the inaugural Vice Dean of Inclusion and Diversity at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, a position she assumed on August 1st, 2013. Oh, that's the day my first son was born. She's also a professor of ophthalmology at the University of Pennsylvania. She has been a member of the National Academy of Medicine since 2000, serving on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine consensus committees and the NAM Roundtable on the Promotion of Health Equity. She's a graduate of MIT and Harvard Medical School with SB and SM degrees in chemical engineering. Dr. Higginbotham completed a residency in ophthalmology at LSU and fellowship training at MEEI in Boston. In 2020, she completed a Master of Law degree from the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. You have a lot of degrees. I'm very impressed. Okay, so let me turn it over to the two of you. I'm very excited to hear your talk.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. And along with Ms. Maria Dahlberg, I'm very, very happy to be here. Certainly the previous presentation really nicely set us up for focusing on this topic. This is really a focus now on the United States, if you will, based on our study. And it really is laudable that the Department of Energy is now focused on the culture in the workplace, because as one who has been in academia for 40 years, I can attest to how important the culture is and how important leadership is in its role to ensure that the culture is inclusive and supportive. And so now I'll turn to our report, and we're both very happy to be here with you to present this impact of COVID-19 on the careers of women in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine report, a report that was undertaken during the pandemic. Next slide, please. We try to begin all of the presentations on this report by acknowledging that while the focus of our statement of task, and indeed the focus of our report, is on the impact of COVID-19 on women in academic STEM, the pandemic was not the only devastating event of 2020, as we all recognize, nor did it impact all women equally. During stressful times, those of us who are systemically disadvantaged are more likely to evidence additional strain, as well as instability, compared to those who have an established reputation, a stable salary commitment, or positions of power. As a woman of color, certainly I can attest to the fact that we are often more affected more significantly than others, given the layering of gender bias and racism that can influence our career trajectories. And this past year was both stressful, but also infused with hope, given the expanded conversations nationally related to structural racism. Next slide, please. Our report on COVID and women in STEM builds on research that was well established even before the pandemic, but has taken on new meaning in light of 2020. As was shown in the National Academy's Promising Practices Report, and this Promising Practices Report is also downloadable for free, as well as our report at the nap.edu website, National Academies of Press, and we'll have that on our last slide, so you can download both of these reports. But I want to particularly highlight the Promising Practices Report, which was released last year, right at the beginning of the pandemic, so may not have gotten the exposure that it deserved. It actually teed up a lot of evidence-based interventions that can be used, as well as the differences in culture across all disciplines in STEM. We certainly have also recognized that there are not as many women across all STEM disciplines as we would like there to be. And so it's more common that we as women are underrepresented across many fields, including engineering. And while there's been progress in recent years, there are many long-standing systemic barriers that remain, particularly for women of color. Next slide, please. Even before COVID-19, there were discrepancies by gender in salary, as we all know, caregiver status, as we all know, as well as stress, as we learn from the survey that our speakers presented before us. Caregiving in particular, both at home and at work, commonly falls to women, and women of color take on additional and often unrecognized labor in the form of mentoring and service expectations. You know, certainly it's a labor of love, but nevertheless, it does tap into that energy that we could use for other things that would help us with our personal well-being. And these differences hold when examined across careers, institutions, and disciplines. Next slide, please. Therefore, throughout the report and building on the approach taken in the Promising Practice report that I mentioned earlier, the committee, our committee, took an intentionally intersectional lens, which is defined here. This was particularly important because of the differences in how women of color were or may be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. I had the honor of learning from and with a small, dedicated, and highly insightful team, and we worked together to identify and analyze disruptions experienced by women in STEM academic careers during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. I particularly want to recognize our sponsors, and you can see that they're federal agencies like your agency certainly have contributed to this report. We could not have done this report without the benefit of our sponsors. In addition to the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, we also were joined in sponsorship by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and particularly I want to recognize as well the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Next slide, please. In our report, we lay out 12 findings and 31 research questions, which predominantly align with foci of the 5 central chapters of the report shown here in the 5 colored boxes. And you can see that we touch on the very topics that were highlighted in the previous survey that you heard in the first presentation, beginning with academic productivity and institutional responses, work-life boundaries and gender divisions of labor, collaborations, networks, and role of professional organizations, academic leadership and decision-making, and most importantly, because it's such a cross-cutting issue, mental health and well-being. We also present the findings of a survey of women STEM faculty conducted for the report by Kosick, Allen, and Dumas in October of 2020 on the effects of COVID-19. Our statement of task did not ask us, and we do not make recommendations. I know many of you who read our National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine reports are used to recommendations, but this is a report that tees up research questions. We provide a snapshot. On the other hand, we provide a snapshot of our understanding at the end of 2020, along with the research questions to try and help guide future work. Essentially, we are asking organizations, institutions, leadership to spend time thinking about what is it that we have all learned from this pandemic, and using the guidance of these 31 research questions, how can I ensure that policies and practices that are being implemented have the intended consequences? Next slide, please. Our first 3 findings were strongly based on well-established research that we knew before the pandemic. First, we found that while progress has been made with respect to the representation of women in STEM, it is fragile, very fragile, and prone to setbacks, especially at times of crisis such as the pandemic. We also knew that the confluence of social stressors we experienced during 2020 had the potential to exacerbate mental health conditions like insomnia, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, especially for women. We as women respond differently to these social stressors, and it usually will demonstrate itself in terms of any challenges to mental health in just symptoms such as insomnia, which can then actually move into more serious patterns. And so it's not substance abuse, which is what you see in men, but it's really more insomnia and depression and anxiety that we see more commonly in women. And we found that even during these periods of high social stress, perhaps even more so during periods of high social stress, it remains important to have a focus on intersectionality and equity in our work, and to account for differences in experiences, particularly for women of color. And I'm really emphasizing equity as opposed to equality, because the needs are going to be different for each of the populations that you may have within your laboratory space. It's about equity, adjusting for whatever those needs may be, as opposed to equality, assuming that everyone will respond to the same policy. These 3 findings are largely based on what we knew from quote unquote before times. Next slide, please. It's not an understatement to say that COVID-19 changed nearly everything last year, academic STEM included. We all recognize that there were delayed experiments in individual laboratories, canceled global scientific conferences, shifted teaching and networking structures, altered population rates and blurred the boundaries between the work and non-work, as we all have experienced, working from a space that was primarily our home space that we often had to share with others while we're working. And so there's a blurring of that line between what is work and what's non-work. Certainly adaptations were made, but the disruptions caused by the pandemic endangered the engagement, experience, and retention of women in academic STEM. And this is the most important concern that we have, that we may lose women from academic STEM. Next slide, please. It was well documented before 2020 in both preclinical and human studies that chronic and unpredictable stress, such as what occurred during the pandemic in 2020, is the most detrimental form of stress for health. Women tend to be the major caregivers within an extended family, and as a result, they are more likely to experience increased stress associated with caring for ourselves, loved ones, or friends who contract disease. Along with social isolation and sheltering, there's been an increase in domestic violence during COVID-19 pandemic, adding yet another stressor predominantly for women. Next slide, please. Women and other represented groups studying and working in STEM fields are disadvantaged to a greater degree than our counterparts who are white and men. Women in academic STEM fields are more likely to be early in our careers, have a lower salary regardless of professional ranking in STEM, be a single parent or a primary caregiver, and report experiencing greater work-related stress and discrimination in the workplace of our community. Because we as women are represented across most STEM fields, women are more likely to experience academic isolation, including limited access to mentors, sponsors, and role models that share our same life experiences, whatever identity we relate to. And when coupled with the physical isolation, this had an even greater impact on our well-being during this pandemic. Next slide, please. The October survey that I mentioned earlier certainly wasn't global, but it was United States. This was a survey of women in academic STEM, as noted, conducted by one of the authors of our commissioned papers, which actually translated to one of our chapters by Kosak, Allen, and Dumas, included questions about work effectiveness. To note, this is a non-representative survey, and so rather than focus on the specific percentages shown, it can be taken to provide examples of impacts. As shown here, women reported increased workload, decreased productivity, changes in interactions, and difficulties due to the remote nature of working. Next slide, please. Women with caregiving responsibilities such as child or elder care had less time to maintain or engage in collaborations or even conduct our work. For example, in the October survey, over 70% of the responding women with childcare responsibilities reported challenges with lack of access to childcare, and over half reported children's heightened behavioral and academic needs. A quarter of the women, the most popular response, reported their coping strategy involved simply being the primary caregiver. Other research showed that women reduced their work hours to accommodate caregiving responsibilities, and certainly those reduced work hours translate into less attention to what they need in order to advance in their professions. Next slide, please. COVID-19 blurred boundaries between various roles during 2020. And while remote work can facilitate the management of non-work roles, it also increases multitasking, interruptions, and work availability that may harm mental health and well-being. I mean, one of my colleagues, I recall, presented in the UK in the morning and in San Francisco in the late evening. And certainly this all occurred within 24 hours. And while this sounds very interesting, I think we can all relate to the stress as well as the need for preparation for such major presentations. But the blurring of these lines occurred often, reducing energy from women to do other things that can address their well-being. And then finally, women have adapted many boundary management tactics to help during 2020, including ones reported in the October survey. These include spatial boundaries, like separate workplaces, and if we go to slide 15, that would be great. Temporal boundaries, like creating schedules, and technological boundaries, like using more than one computer. They are not, however, fail-safes, and relying on them to support the well-being of women in academic STEM may be insufficient. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague, Ms. Maria Dahlberg. Maria.
Thanks so much, Eve. So as Eve mentioned, we were not asked to make recommendations, but rather to provide this set of findings as well as research questions that can help inform future work, given sort of the existence of only the preliminary research we have had on hand at the end of 2020. So for the next several slides, I'm just going to walk through an overview of our findings and those research questions that align with these 5 major areas in our report. And as a committee, we wanted to make sure that as we crafted the 31 research questions in our report, we provided questions that were both able to help us more fully understand the impacts of the pandemic, but also allowed us to identify and grow into opportunities that could help leaders and decision makers as they look for new ways to engage and move forward in creating more equitable and inclusive and supportive higher education research systems. These research questions range across a variety of different aspects of the impact of COVID-19 on women's research participation in STEM, particularly for women of color, and look at how policies and practices may affect both the short and long-term career trajectories of women. When we looked at academic productivity in 2020, we found that with variation by discipline, women in fact published fewer papers and received fewer citations of their work between March of 2020 and December of 2020. This may in turn affect their job stability and career trajectories, and may even affect their future ability to obtain funding. These initial measures of productivity indicate a negative impact of the pandemic on the careers of women in academic STEM. And moreover, the COVID-19 has exacerbated many of the stresses women in academia feel under usual conditions. For example, delays in obtaining clearance for conducting their research during 2020. As a result of the pandemic, led researchers to experience increased burnout, the sleep disturbances, poor appetite, and increased interpersonal problems, as well as decreased motivation. Many of the bench-heavy sciences experienced widespread lab closures, whereas more computationally based fields reported being able to continue their work in collaborations and may have even had minimal declines in research. So as you can see, there was great variation across disciplines. Many colleges and universities offered tenure clock extensions, and federal and private funders offered extensions on funding or grants. However, these changes did not necessarily align with the needs expressed by women, and such as flexibility or requests for reduced workload, nor did they generally benefit faculty who were not on the tenure clock. This aligns also with what we heard from our previous speakers. As reported in the October survey done for this report, women implemented so many different boundary management strategies, but relying on these strategies rather than developing organizational level approaches is likely to be insufficient to address the challenges that we were facing and continue to face in this realm. In terms of the work-life boundaries, issues associated with this increased workload, decreased productivity, and changes in interpersonal interactions, as well as those difficulties caused by remote work, were particularly salient for women who had caregiving responsibilities. How we can learn and grow from supportive resources that were provided or were needed during the past year, like childcare, like flexible working options, still remains. We found, though, that technology has been beneficial for the continuation of so many collaborations. It facilitated the increased participation of women and other underrepresented populations in many activities. However, not all collaborations could be facilitated online, and some collaborations face challenges like needing to find a time to engage synchronously. Many professional society conferences adapted quickly to virtual platforms and continue to do so. And this facilitated global participation, which often actually increased the participation by removing travel-related barriers that can affect women more than men. Eve's story about her colleague who presented both in England as well as San Francisco in the same day simply would not have happened previously. However, these shifts to virtual platforms, how these shifts to virtual platforms will impact networking as well as advancement of women is still unclear. When we looked at academic leadership and decision-making, we found that many of the decisions from the last year were made quickly, and that is very understandable. But they also frequently deviated from the effective practices in academic governance, such as those that are well known in crisis or equity-minded leadership. These fast decisions often negatively impacted positions that are more likely to be held by women or people of color. There were some leaders who engaged in approaches to make decisions, to govern, or to be held accountable that were more gender inclusive and may actually help eradicate growing equity gaps. In fact, some campuses have begun to think about the long-term implications of the pandemic and suggested strategies to address these issues, including revising their strategic plans. And of course, importantly, and the issue that we're here to talk about, when we considered how the pandemic might be affecting the mental health and the well-being of women in academic STEM, we cannot stress the fact that social support becomes very important during stressful situations, and the isolation that was imposed on everyone was particularly amplified for women in academic STEM, who are so additionally isolated in their specific fields and disciplines. Again, what we've shared here today is only a fraction of what's in the full report, and we recognize it's going to take many years likely to fully understand the wide-ranging consequences of the pandemic for the careers of women in academic STEM. Taken together, these findings and the research questions can highlight some of the risks we face in losing the gains that we've made in recent years in hopefully creating more diverse, inclusive, and supportive higher education and research systems. But we know that there are opportunities to re-emphasize the promising practices that we have on hand, as well as what we are learning from the pandemic as we look forward to post-COVID operations. So thank you on behalf of myself and Dr. Higginbotham. There is a lot more in the report, which is available at nap.edu. I'll drop these URLs in the chat so you can access them directly. Both this report and the Promising Practices report are available for free, and we're looking forward to joining the question Q&A after the remaining talks.
Thank you so much, Eve and Maria. That was wonderful explanation of all the various issues that we have faced as a result of the pandemic. And I'm looking forward to your participation in the panel. And I should note that if you do have any questions that are occurring to you, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or chat. And I am recording them all, and so I can bring them up later on when we have our full panel available. So now we're going to turn to some discussion of potential best practices and how we can improve mentoring relationships for organizations and institutions. So let me introduce Dr. Melissa McDaniels. She is the Associate Executive Director and Associate Scientist at the Center for Improvement of Mentored Experience and Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a co-investigator and community advancement manager for the NIH-supported National Research Mentoring Network, and is also leading a project as part of the American Physical Society's NSF Inclusive Graduate Education Network. Prior to working at MSU, she held full-time positions at Northeastern University, Boston College, and National Geographic Society. She has over 20 years of experience in graduate student and faculty development, undergraduate and graduate teaching and learning, and organizational change. And I will turn it over to you, Melissa.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you to Susanna and my fellow panelists for this opportunity to be with you today, to learn from and with all of you. I've been asked to talk about what is known from a research side as well as practice side about how improving research mentoring relationships can support researcher mental health and work-life integration, particularly in, I think the words post-COVID era. I would like to say we're probably not post-COVID, but in this next stage of COVID. For the participants, I have created a Google Doc. You see the URL at the top of my screen. After I speak, I will put that in the chat, or Susanna, if you could. And what my attempt here is to provide you with links to the resources I refer to in my talk, so you don't have to scramble and write things down. And if there are additional resources that come up in the Q&A, I will also add them there. So again, as Susanna said, I am a co-investigator with something called the Inclusive Graduate Education Network and Associate Executive Director of CIMR, the Center for the Improvement of Mentored Experiences and Research. And our mission, we're based at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our team is both based at the College of Education, also funded through the medical school. Our mission is to improve research mentoring relationships for mentees and mentors at all career stages and disciplines through the development, implementation, and study of evidence-based and culturally responsive interventions. Prior to getting started, I always like to sort of put forth some assumptions I'm making that are underlying some of my remarks. First, mentoring is not a panacea. However, it is a major determinant in the likelihood of career success and well-being of researchers. Also making the assumption mental health and well-being have challenged the research workforce long before COVID, but COVID has exacerbated these issues. Systemic inequities and barriers have affected the career trajectories and well-being of minoritized researchers, particularly racially minoritized researchers, long before COVID, and COVID has amplified these disparities. One of the opportunities and challenges of developing this talk today, I'm going to be talking about the 10,000-foot level. We could always go into a lot more detail about any of these ideas. And so what I would like to say is there are implications for individuals, both individual researchers, institutional leaders, as well as policymakers. So what I encourage you to do is, depending upon your positionality, you can extrapolate from some of these recommendations. And finally, what I want to say, and you know this, the DOE National Labs are diverse institutions. I'll be talking a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing with some of the DOE labs, some of whose colleagues I know are on this call. And some are operated by industrial entities, others are operated by universities and or not-for-profit organizations. So I guess that's by way of saying I also am undergoing the assumption that how mentorship plays out, how positionality works with early career researchers can be impacted by the institutional type of those organizations. So you have already heard directly about the one report. There are two additional National Academies reports that a lot of what I'm talking about, some additional resources and research can be found. One is the October 2019 report called The Science of Effective Mentorship in STEM. We are very fortunate to have the study director of that project, Maria Dahlberg, on this call, and who I will turn to if people have some more questions about this report that I cannot answer. Also, the recent NASEM report on mental health, substance abuse, and well-being in higher education. Again, some of my remarks today and the ideas can be further investigated in those two spaces. So in thinking about today, I decided to frame my remarks in terms of 4 recommendations. And again, these recommendations could be for you as individual researchers who are thinking about improving mentorship in your spaces. It could be institutional leaders. It could be policymakers. So these 4 recommendations are: 1, I'm going to argue that language matters. We talk about mentorship. It means many different things to many different people. So one of my recommendations is to be talking about using a shared definition of mentorship. I'm also going to suggest, what the National Academy's 2019 report showed. There is a science of mentorship. There is empirical data supporting the efficacy of some of these practices and ideas. When you're talking to your colleagues about elevating mentorship and the conversation about mentorship, I really encourage you to leverage research, some of the research support for some of the ideas you talk about. Third, I'm going to encourage you to engage in some evidence-based research mentorship education, or at least make your communities have access to that. And then finally, I'm going to recommend for you to access resources for your own further learning. So I wanted to start off with, from my perspective, I want to offer this definition of mentorship. It is one that my colleagues, the National Academy's consensus report team offered. And again, the definition is mentorship is a professional working alliance. So focusing on this is a working alliance between individuals who are proactive roles in those alliances, in which they work together over time to support not only professional, but also personal growth, development, and success through the provision of career and psychosocial support. And again, career support examples, that could be very specific career guidance, skill development, sponsorship for employment opportunities. Psychosocial support functions are things like emotional support, role modeling. And again, the big picture here is, our hope is to say the national labs can build a robust, diverse group of talent across all career stages. But this again is the definition that I am offering today. I think it's really important to distinguish between mentorship, which is that process that I just defined, and specific titles and roles. So whether you in a laboratory are a research supervisor, a technical manager, a faculty member, a formally assigned career mentor, a peer, any of those people in those roles can engage in mentorship activity. So again, I encourage you, because sometimes people get a little caught up in mixing up those two things. So I think it's really important to say mentorship, as defined here, is a process that can be engaged in by anyone, regardless of their employment role. So my second recommendation is to leverage the research on mentorship. Again, as an organizational scholar and education scholar, I love the 300 pages of resources and references in the science of effective mentorship in STEM. There are a lot of, again, for those of you who want to read more, and I'll be talking a little bit about a very accessible resource that can help you dig into some of the research as much or as little as you would like. So again, in terms of you engaging the research, part of, and I think we all agree to this, but being able to talk about, we know mentorship and mentoring matters. Really unequivocal research that says we know that trainees who experience positive mentoring experiences have an enhanced sense of science identity, a sense of belonging in a research enterprise, and increased self-efficacy, so a belief that they can succeed in their scientific realm. There is research related to persistence. So again, the quality of mentoring and persistence have a very strong relationship. Research productivity. There is research that talks about the link between mentorship and research productivity. And this in particular, in my experience in talking to leaders and scientists across the country, is a point and a bit of evidence that was really important to some stakeholders, obviously. Mentoring, also high quality mentoring, can lead to higher career satisfaction. And finally, but not lastly, mental health and well-being. So again, a series of arguments by saying, why is it important to have these conversations in your institutions? Here, that's some of the research for you. There's also my colleague, Christine Fund, and Dr. Angela Byers-Winston at the University of Wisconsin-Madison wrote an article in AIDS and Behavior in 2016 that really lays out some of the attributes of effective mentoring relationships. And so that is a long list you can see here. I will be talking in a little bit about what are some approaches labs and you can take to enhance those attributes within mentoring relationships. But again, listed as research skills, interpersonal skills, these psychosocial skills, diversity and culturally focused skills, sponsorship skills, and also thinking about how to do career stage appropriate interventions. So from the 2020 NASM report on mental health and well-being, we know that good mentorship practices in general serve as a protective factor for researcher mental health. So again, this is by saying if the best practices in mentorship are engaged in, there is some evidence that it's a protective factor against negative mental health repercussions for trainees. However, and very specifically related to our time today, is research mentors can engage in practices that have been specifically shown to directly attend to mental well-being of researchers. And actually one of the mentorship education programs I'll be talking about has a whole module now on researcher well-being that was developed with the help of Julie Passelt, who is also on the consensus panel for the 2020 NASM report. Finally, the research has told us that effective mentorship is a learned skill. In 2014, in the Academic Medicine publication, again, a team of my colleagues from across the country did a randomized control trial looking at the implementation of entering mentoring, which is a particular mentorship education curriculum that was developed actually in the biological sciences. And as I mentioned in a bit, it is now being adapted for researchers in national labs. But that study was really interesting. It was a double-blind trial. And what it showed is one of the results were mentors self-assess themselves across a number of mentoring competencies as more skilled in a pre and post test. And their mentees, so the half the mentors in this trial participated in this training. Their mentees were blinded to this participation, and they also assessed their mentors as increasing in some of these skill areas. Finally, as we wind down this section on research, I think it's it's imperative for us to recognize and respond to cultural identities in our mentorship, and the research is robust that says this contributes to a mentorship effectiveness. And specifically, mentorship can ameliorate negative effects of students' feelings of being othered due to their non-science identities in STEM by increasing inclusion and psychosocial support. So I will also say that mentorship education, and at least the approach I'll be talking about, even though there are different competencies that aren't specifically focused on diversity and inclusion, I really encourage you to engage in conversations, let's say about communication skills and aligning expectations with a lens towards identity. And there are also some very intensive, culturally aware mentor training interventions that are accessible to you that I will also talk about later. So recommendation number 3 to all of you is, again, engage in some evidence-based mentorship education. And as I have been talking about previously, the Entering Mentoring curriculum was developed about, 10 to 15 years ago. It's an evidence-based approach developed by scholars and thought leaders at Wisconsin. And what is exciting is there's a series of standardized competencies and validated assessments related to those competencies that are available. And these, by the way, are open access. And in the resources, I will be sharing some how to do that with you. But again, 2 of the modules are specifically focused on fostering wellness and well-being and cultivating work-life integration. And actually, Dr. Higginbotham, one of your colleagues at Penn, actually did some empirical work looking at one of these specific modules on work-life integration in the research environment. And again, I'll have a link to this in my resources. So to continue, this research mentorship education approach, it has been adapted for different career stages. So the mentors of faculty, graduate students, postdocs, and undergraduates. It's been adapted for disciplines and institutional types. And again, this work through the University of Wisconsin, it's been developed with generous funding from NSF, Howard Hughes, NIH, and other funders. And as I mentioned, it's all open access. So recommendation 4, this is where I start talking about some resources that you will be able to access. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you right now. On the link that I offered, I also have my email address if you have some further questions. So one resource is, as I mentioned, the Inclusive Graduate Education Network. The American Physical Society received this grant in 2018 or 19. It is a part of NSF's Includes portfolio, focusing on trying to diversify the STEM workforce. SIMR, my organization, is a sub-awardee. And those are the 3 broader goals of iGen. And SIMR's role specifically is to adapt this existing curriculum that was started to be implemented in academia, particularly in the biomedical sciences, for the national laboratory context. And so on the resource sheet I shared, you have the opportunity to insert your name and your email, and I can send you some more detailed information as this gets published. And as I mentioned, this new curriculum will be called Mentorship Education for Scientists at Federally Funded Research Centers. I will tell you, before we got the Includes grant, we're very fortunate to engage with some colleagues at Sandia National Laboratories, both in Albuquerque and Livermore, who really got us thinking about how to make the case studies and the different curricula particularly relevant to those laboratory contexts. So I always like to acknowledge Sandia as a part of this journey here. But the Includes grant and the adaptation of curriculum has been done with an incredibly talented team from Argonne National Laboratory. I think Dr. Tina Henn from Argonne is on this call, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory. So again, this has not been published yet, but it is coming very close to being published. We're going to be actually trying to recruit folks from different labs to receive training in delivering this. So again, more details to come on that. This is a link to the broader SIMR website, where again, an additional set of open access resources related to training mentees as well as mentors exists. I'd like to, I don't mean to be self-promoting about this, but there's two articles that could be very useful to you right now. And I say self-promoting, back in, February of 2021, Chris Fund and myself and Angela Byers-Winston and some others published an article in Life Sciences Education called Reassess, Realign, and Reimagine, a guide to mentors pivoting to remote research mentoring. And what that article does, and there's a chart in that article that's particularly accessible to say, guide mentors and trainees through a series of questions that they should address as they pivoted again from mostly in person to remote. And this past week, Chris Fund published another article in Nature talking about, okay, we sort of made this dramatic shift to predominantly remote work. We are now shifting, I never say back, we're shifting to something else. And again, the recommendations we have is to be really intentional about transitions. And there isn't just going to be one moment of these transitions, as I think we all know. Some of us may be going back to being in-person engaged with colleagues, but even what that in-person is going to look like is going to be different than before times. So I wanted to draw your attention to these two articles. Again, I have links to these on my Google Doc. And I think the main theme is be intentional, really plan in-person interactions, sort of realign or at least re-examine expectations you have of your colleagues and yourself. Really recognize the psychosocial needs that particularly have always been there, but particularly will be important in working with trainees. And then I'd like to say to leaders and mentors, lead by example. Entering back into these spaces, sort of owning the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and collectively saying we're sort of all in this together. Just the last few resources, the 2019 National Academies Report. Maria, you just did a wonderful job in also having this online guide to the science of effective mentorship in STEM. Very accessible. It has links to the full report, but also to different components that particularly practitioners, leaders, individual mentors might find particularly useful. And again, I have some links for you there. And again, finally, this is a screenshot of the resource sheet that I put together for you that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. The further interest form is for you to fill out if you're interested in learning more specifically about the mentorship education work that's happening at the national labs and across the laboratories. So I encourage you to fill that out. And again, there's also resources listed, all the resources that I shared in this workshop. So with that, I want to thank folks, and I will pass it back to Susanna.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was fantastic. And I will make sure to share all of these resources via email because I know I also am unable to cut and paste from the chat. And just one more plug, if anyone has questions for the speakers, we will be going through this after our last speaker, Sarah Alden. So I think this was a great lineup because we heard from three wonderful expert presentations, kind of external points of view, and now we are going to hear from the laboratories themselves. For ideas how we can remake DOE's Laboratory of the Future work-life balance. And I did kind of struggle over whether I should say post-COVID, but I really mean post the start of COVID, because we certainly are not yet at the end. But quick introduction for Dr. Allendorf. She's the Director of Chemistry, Combustion, and Materials Science Center, which advances fundamental groundbreaking research in chemical and material sciences. She also leads the Combustion Research Facility, a Department of Energy Office of Science collaborative research facility, and international leader in combustion science and technology for 40 years. In addition, she serves as Program Area Director for the Transportation, Energy, and Systems Program within Sandia's Energy and Homeland Security portfolio. She has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the College of William and Mary and a PhD in physical chemistry from Stanford University. And today she'll be speaking from her perspective as a member of DOE's Oppenheimer Science and Energy Leadership Program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I'm batting cleanup today. And let's see, let's do this, get the sharing working. And let's start the, whoops, let's go to the beginning. There we go. Everything good?
Sarah, we see your notes. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, you don't want to see my notes. Okay, terrific. You would think that after all this time, I'd be good at this, but you know, just gotta change it up. Okay, so thanks for that introduction. And I'll tell you, this has been an amazing seminar or workshop to be part of. I have a new reading list and I'm excited to go and click around and learn from these wonderful women that have preceded me. So my role is going to be to share some observations from the perspective of being at a lab. And so I will, here's my bottom line up front. I have 4 recommendations to share. And these actions are, let us treat our researchers as the leaders that they are and help them grow from where they are now. The second point, we need to lean into hybrid work because that's what's coming, quote, post-COVID. But let's do it while advancing inclusion. Point number 3, I believe we need to systematically and purposefully embrace collaboration over competition across the labs. And point number 4, let's focus on first level leaders in order to fully support our researchers. So you heard from my introduction, I'm a career-long National Lab employee. I can't remember if she mentioned that I did a postdoc. I went to Stanford, I did a postdoc at Lawrence Livermore, and then I moved over to Sandia as a researcher, and then I moved into leadership. I'm also a member of the Oppenheimer Program, and I'll describe that in a few minutes. What wasn't in my bio is that I'm a proud mother of 2 amazing young women, and it is a joy to watch them develop into professionals in the emerging fields of statistics, computer science, and machine learning. So why am I here? Well, we were talking with Susanna about some of our think pieces for our Oppenheimer program, and she thought we might bring some value to this discussion. So let me tell you about the Oppenheimer program. So it's the Oppenheimer Science and Energy Leadership Program. I'm a member of the 4th cohort. The program goals are listed here. To build a network of emerging leaders across the labs, provide these fellows with a rich systems level understanding of the labs, DOE, and stakeholders. And we really did encompass the full spectrum of all DOE missions and lab capabilities. We had very candid discussion with the lab and DOE leadership on challenges and opportunities. And also the program is intended to mentor the fellows to help develop their ability to critically assess the DOE lab system through a set of think pieces that look at those challenges and opportunities for the DOE system. So here's our picture. This was January 2020. At our first lab visits, we went to New Mexico and toured Los Alamos, and then we came to Sandia. You may recognize the Sandia mountain in the background there. It was tremendous, tremendous fun. We got to know each other at restaurants and meals and off time. And then, as you can well imagine, a few weeks later, we realized we weren't going to be traveling together anymore. So we then pivoted, as everybody has been pivoting, to Zoom experiences. So then we got to see each other in Zoom windows. Now, we had visited 2 labs, but now we have, by now, more than a year later, we have visited all of the labs using various levels of virtual approaches. Over the past about 16 months, we've engaged in more than 50 separate discussions with mentors who are former DOE leaders, lab leaders, and colleagues, more than 3,000 emails, hundreds of hours of Zoom, Skype, Teams, WebEx meetings, and a couple happy hours where we all learned what the heck Slack is and figured out how to use it. Over this time, we developed 5 different think pieces. And so these were small perspectives on topics that emerged during our many conversations over the past months of being in this program. Here are the think pieces that we developed. I'm going to focus on the first 2 and bring some of our learnings from that into today's discussion about mental health and successful researchers at the, and with a focus on researchers in the labs. So the first that I'll bring thoughts from is building the future of the labs from the lessons learned during COVID-19. The second think piece was the importance of leadership agility at the US DOE National Laboratories, lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. In this case, we define leadership agility as the ability to effectively lead, manage, and inspire your team during turbulent times and complex situations. And now there were several groups of colleagues that I worked with on these, and I will acknowledge them at the end of my presentation. It was a tremendous fun team to work with. Okay, so what can I add to this conversation about research and mental health? So I bring myself to this conversation. At the beginning of COVID, I was a brand new center director, and as we all experienced, things were changing dramatically. So I really upped my incidence of Skype meetings and started sending out lots of emails. Those emails at one point were basically daily, and they became very personal. My staff were asking me questions, and I would get responses to each of those emails. They wanted to know what I knew, what did I think was going to happen next, how was I feeling, when can we come back to the lab? And they also wanted to share their own perspectives and worries. They would share their little IT hacks they had figured out, how to make masks. They wanted to share their victories, large and small. I heard a lot about people's families. So these emails were completely heartfelt and inspiring. Now, at the same time, I was also part of the Oppenheimer Program. And so I was getting to know this terrific group of cohort colleagues and mentors from across the complex. We also compared notes, found best practices, vented a little bit, sometimes a lot, and taught each other all sorts of different tricks around software packages. So to be honest, I was incredibly fortunate because I had an amazing support system around me. And I think that really helped me be a much more effective leader. So now I'm wondering, what can we do? What can I do as an institutional leader to support our researchers so that they too can thrive in normal times as well as in times of crisis? So that brings me to these 4 actions I'm going to walk through. And I believe that these are actions that can really help our researchers thrive in the labs of the future. So first, treat our researchers as the leaders they are. Second, lean into the hybrid workplace and particularly embracing inclusion as we do that. Third, improve partnering across the labs. And fourth, focus on the first level leaders. Okay, so our researchers, you know, in many of the labs, we tend to have 2 tracks. We have a staff track and we have a management track. And we give lots of management opportunities for leadership training, but we don't tend to do that as much for our researchers. Now, we heard earlier about the importance of mentoring, and I totally agree with that comment. I think we've got to recognize that our researchers really are leaders, and they need those skills. They may or may not have developed them in graduate school. So in our thought piece around leadership agility, we identified a set of attributes that we believe help leaders weather crises. But you know, a lot of those attributes I think are completely relevant for our researchers, particularly at the labs. Research is a team sport. It is very rarely individual activities. And so you've got to get your work done and you've got to inspire others to come with you. So if we could deepen the leadership skills of our researchers, I believe that would help them be more effective as researchers, but even more importantly, likely benefit their mental health and deepen their resiliency as they figure out how to really work with others. So there's plenty of literature on leadership, and a lot of it is tied when you actually have authority. And in a research leadership model, authority is often not as obvious. There can be authority if you are, for example, the PI of a project and you can decide who gets to spend what money. But in general, leadership comes through charm and inspiration and influence, sort of inspiring people to come along with you. And in my experience, the most outstanding technical staff are also incredible leaders. They guide, inspire, and nudge their colleagues gently. They create an environment where everyone brings and shares their very best ideas, questions each other, and makes each other better. Now, I also found that the staff that I'm thinking of weathered COVID fairly successfully. And they also tend to be very experienced staff who have learned these leadership skills through the School of Hard Knocks. So what I'm saying is I find that most of our PhD scientists have had very little formal leadership coursework or training. Now, they've learned what they learned in grad school, and some of our faculty are wonderful leadership mentors, some not so much. Okay, so what are the attributes of leadership that we identified for formal leaders that I think are really relevant for researchers? They're listed here. First, emotional intelligence. Know your leadership style, be skilled and flexible, and recognize and value your colleagues' needs and flex into that. Second, develop a range of effective communication approaches, formal and informal. Learn how to adapt your message and style to meet the needs of those around you. Third, build trusting relationships by following through with commitments. In addition, seek regular and direct feedback and act on it. And finally, fourth, pay attention to self-care. Now, self-care is often underemphasized in grad school. And so when we get new employees coming to the labs, often they really don't know how experienced professional staff balance their lives. And they frankly haven't maybe developed some of the approaches that would be really useful. In addition, some research groups and labs engage in serious hero worship, where the number of hours worked, presence in the office or the lab during evenings and weekends, these are all taken as signs of commitment. So understanding the value of self-care, I think, is really critical to creating a sustainable career in either research or in management. Okay, second point, embrace the realities of 21st century post-COVID research. And here I see two opportunities, leaning into hybrid work and the opportunity to make inclusion more systemic. So let's put them together. So on the topic of hybrid work, look, once our labs got the IT worked out, much to our surprise, our institutions actually did okay with this remote work business. We appear to be delivering on our deliverables. Productivity, we're not so sure about. That's hard. We're finding that hard to measure right now, and we're trying to monitor that. But some, as individuals, some of us did better than others. And as you all know, along with numerous outside companies, many of our DOE labs are now leaning into a new paradigm of a hybrid workplace, where some folks are going to just stay remote. Some folks will be in the office all the time, and some will be moving back and forth. Some of our competitors are even using the opportunity to work remotely as an attraction benefit. Wall Street Journal this weekend even called remote work the new signing bonus. Interesting. However, across our conversations with the lab leaders, we find that many executives are reporting concerns in two key areas as institutions start to contemplate moving into hybrid workplace: maintaining culture and ensuring equity in productivity, pay, and opportunities, including promotions, between workers who are on-site or remote. Okay, so our Oppenheimer team has recommended great intentionality as the labs get great at hybrid work, and we heard intentionality earlier as well. First, the lab should identify and implement policies and practices that intentionally describe the ground rules for long-term successful implementation and cultural assimilation of employees. So there's areas where this can show up immediately. For example, onboarding new folks. We believe that early in-person interactions are essential, particularly with the first line supervisor, but also with peers and leadership. This will help the adoption of culture and increase productivity and success. Second, for collaboration, we expect many meetings will continue to be hybrid, with some participants remote and others together in a room. So the full use of nearly flawless technology is going to be essential to ensure all participants are engaged and fully included in those discussions. Also for collaboration, we need to find solutions, software, and maybe even advanced robotic solutions to help facilitate those random interactions that can enable innovation. And finally, the last point on hybrid is that in order to maintain remote work muscle memory, on-site employees should be strongly encouraged to work remotely at least 2 or 3 days a quarter, or to VTC into some meetings even when they're on site, or use in the background virtual software routinely to interact with others. This will help reinforce the "we are all equal when we are each in a Zoom box" mentality that frankly for some of us has actually been quite nice during COVID. So this is great, but I think we need to watch and not think that remote work is going to be a cure-all. It may work for some, but not for others. And we're going to need policies that continue to support the complexities of our current life. And we need practices that do not punish those who actually use the policies. So there's some literature emerging to suggest that flexible benefits help the full workforce only when the full workforce, and here I mean the dominant group, also visibly use those benefits. So leaders, if you're asking your folks to work remotely, you need to do so as well. If you're asking your folks to come in or behave certain way in meetings, you've got to do it yourself also. Okay, but I don't want to jump past the word about inclusion. So one of the opportunities of this COVID experience has been, it's really changed how we think about getting together. So that opportunity then that comes with disruption is to think about how to really lean into inclusion more deeply and make it as systemic as possible. So I would encourage us to think about COVID as a chance to up our inclusion game. Some of the examples that we've been thinking through have been put inclusion on your list of principles as you are thinking about crisis. Build representative teams that are very diverse and engage them in developing new policies and practices. Provide multiple paths for direct feedback to lab leadership, ensuring voices from diverse groups are heard. Transitioning out of COVID is going to be a change to establish new employee research groups or get new employee feedback mechanisms. Trust me, your staff want to be heard before decisions are made that will change where and how they work. My third point is we've got to improve partnering across the labs. We need to systemically and purposefully embrace collaboration over competition at the labs. Look, there are many important problems to be solved for our country. As researchers, we need to focus on the problems and put our energies into finding creative and effective solutions. How might we realize even more the value of the entire DOE complex? During our Oppenheimer program, we recognized that experiences working at other labs tends to make people more invested in the lab's mission. Cross-lab experiences also help build research partnerships by breaking down barriers and allowing curiosity to flourish. Now, moving between labs happens all the time, but frankly, as we know, changing employers is a big step and can be rather disruptive to families. But at the same time, clearly COVID has changed how we think about remote work. We actually have the tools to do it. As a result, the calculus for extended visits at each other's sites has changed dramatically. Basically, our ability to work remotely enables productive, less disruptive cross-lab exchanges. So we've recommended to the DOE leadership that we take the best of work from home opportunity and expand it across the labs by establishing a cross-lab scientific exchange program. It could be 3 months, could be a year, a few people per lab. The idea is that a staff member would physically move to the new location to collaborate, learn the lab, and develop partnerships, but continue to be paid by their home lab. And they would probably spend about half of their time working for the home lab. This will enable the return when they need to come back. And with software and asynchronous tools, I think this is much more possible to do remotely. Now, this program needs to be structured in lots of ways to enable flexibility for families, to engage the diverse demographic. For example, where are you in your career path? Now, we appreciate there's a lot of details to work out, but we think that what we've learned from COVID and remote work really changes the picture, and we really need to lean into this as an opportunity to bring more value from this amazing set of laboratories that are the DOE labs. So my final point is actually to focus on the environment around our researchers. And that is, I in particular want to bring it down to our first level leaders. In the Department of Energy labs, we have managers who do hiring and firing and performance review, but they also do a lot more in many cases. And so I believe we need to assure that our first level leaders are exquisitely strong in their own leadership abilities, including coaching and mentoring. And we need to hold our leaders accountable for nurturing their staff as complete human beings. Now, this point bridges to other points I've made already. In my experience, the first level leader has a huge impact on the local research environment. What they do is very visible. What they pay attention to, what they talk about, how they spend their time, what they reward, all of this establishes and amplifies the local research climate. And during the Oppenheimer program, we saw close up that the intentional development of first level leaders varies across the labs, and there are a number of truly wonderful practices that could be shared more broadly. Now, I'm closing with this point about the first level leader, because I believe they are critical in establishing and nurturing the local environment that most researchers in the labs are steeped in. The partnership between staff and their manager can be a key resource for research at the labs. This is a resource that is generally, frankly, not replicated in academia and is absolutely a secret sauce for researchers in the DOE labs. So here's my set of 4 recommendations that have emerged from our conversations during our Oppenheimer program and with colleagues across the complex. First, treat our researchers as the leaders they are. Help them grow from where they are now. Second, embrace the realities of 21st century post-COVID research. Lean into hybrid work while advancing inclusion. Point 3, systematically and purposefully embrace collaboration over competition between the labs. And point number 4, focus on the first level leaders. So with that, I'll close and say thank you so much. It's been a tremendous opportunity to be a fellow of the Oppenheimer Science and Energy Leadership Program. So I want to thank the National Lab Director Councils who sponsor that program, our tremendous set of cohort 4 mentors, and then my fellow colleagues who've been in cohort 4. And I particularly want to shout out thanks to the folks whose names are here who worked with me on those 2 thought pieces. With that, I'll close.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was great to hear this perspective from the labs and building so much on what we've heard from the previous speakers. So before I turn into the true Q&A panel, I'd like to invite Cindy Escobar Alvarez to say a few words about her program that she runs at Doris Duke Foundation.
Thank you, Susanna, for making me aware of your workshop and for inviting me. And I'd be happy, while there are challenges, as our speakers, the first ones mentioned, it is not easy being a scientist, right? Particularly one from a group that has been marginalized. And it has really been inspiring and invigorating to hear from all these women in science who are working to improve conditions for well-being and inclusion. And so I lead the medical research program at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, where we support clinical research and the retention and advancement of physician scientists. And this is very far from the work that the audience carries out. But the workshop has really highlighted some commonalities in research experiences across sciences. And so I would like to very briefly share about a tool that your fields and the laboratories and institutions of the future could consider adding to their toolboxes for inclusion and retention. So when women in science have to take time off to go on maternity leave, or a scientist with ailing children or parents is to take some time away from the research, they might feel judged or the need to return as soon as possible to the research. And as we heard from the National Academy study, women have been particularly affected and carry the brunt of the caregiving responsibilities at home because of the pandemic. So imagine if the institution instead came and said, hey, what if we give you temporary staff to continue your work? What if somebody stepped in so your work can continue? So to us, this is a form of inclusion and was inspired by isolated programs at some institutions like Mass General Hospital at the University of Pittsburgh. So the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation launched a national program to support several institutions to do just that. So the Fund to Retain Clinical Scientists is an experimental program that provides US medical schools with support in the form of a grant to help retain their faculty with family caregiving responsibilities. And I will just leave it at for more information. Please visit fundtoretainClinicalScientists.org, and you can read more about this program. And we hope that your fields will adapt it and use a similar intervention. There is some evidence behind it, so you can read at our website on. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. It just seemed like a really great best practice for the rest of us to adopt. So if I could get the rest of the panelists to turn their cameras back on, I'll just start going through the questions that have come through the chats. If you have any other questions, please type them in. So I will start with the ones for our Cactus friends. Any insight as to why it seems many people, nearly half, experience discrimination or harassment, but only 1 in 5 or so say they felt unwelcome? How is it that you can experience harassment or bullying but still feel welcome? Maybe something to do with the frequency of this harassment, or whether it seemed like an outlier incident to them or a norm.
So The stats as per our survey report are around 37% people said they experienced harassment or bullying, and around 64 or so said that they feel, in general, they feel welcome and included. So while there was no assessment of the correlation specifically between those factors, it would be fair to say that those who have experienced harassment or bullying were the majority of those who said they don't feel welcome or included. So the stats that Andrea presented, some of them were only for the US, or so they were segmented, but as the whole population, the data is pretty straightforward there. So there's not too much of an overlap, I think, between that population. Andrea, would you like to add?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. And I feel that if there is a discrepancy, it could be because the question on feeling welcome was mainly about whether they felt welcome irrespective of factors like ethnicity and social background and gender. So it's possible that when they were answering the question on discrimination, harassment, and bullying, they weren't really looking at it or reflecting on experiences with this sort of, with these factors in mind. And they must have just been thinking about experiences as a whole. So it's possible that they didn't view it from the same angle.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll go to the work-life balance question. Work-life balance and mental health are very important. There's a connection between the mind and the body. Why is mental health emphasized while physical health is seemingly de-emphasized? And feel free, anyone can answer this question, of course.
Well, if I might venture forward, and I'm sure Maria will add highlights. One of our commission papers dealt significantly with the topic of mental health, but also emphasized in that chapter how it translates into impactors on physical health. And so one of the institutional opportunities is to have a systemic way to assess mental health as a early predictor of really trying to determine who might need some intervention. So yes, I mean, we only had a few minutes to present all the findings of our report, but I would encourage everyone to read that particular chapter, which comes from colleagues from University of Colorado, particularly Dr. Neil Epperson and her colleagues, and that is the primary emphasis. Maria?
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add, and I think Eve, you actually did touch on this in our presentation a bit, is that, you know, one of the things that we notice, and one of the things that comes across in the literature in terms of sort of an early indicator involves some physical manifestations. So you're looking at cases of insomnia, which may be easier to detect. I might come across with less associated social stigma than some mental health diagnoses. And so people can use those as sort of an engagement or a way to process and seek assistance when it's necessary. And that did come across pretty strongly in that chapter. I think that is definitely something to be aware of and to use as we're moving forward.
If I may add, I think that it's always been easier for people to talk about their physical health, right? And it's not something that's been dismissed. So you could easily go to your boss and say, I have a migraine and it's a really bad migraine and I can't work today. And that would have always been okay. 10 years ago, that would have been okay. But if your migraine is actually is just an outcome or just a manifestation of a lot more that's going on, that's so much more difficult to explain. So I would say that it's actually a good thing if mental health is getting more emphasis right now, not at the cost of physical health, but that would be hard for it to happen anyway, right? I think.
Great points. So wondering how to address the larger systemic issues that create the competitive landscape in research, increasing the sense of scarcity of opportunities and funding, and the factors that create insecurity related to the political landscape that tends to minimize or ignore culturally sensitive approaches to work and life. Not an easy question, so.
If I might start, I again would like to highlight the Promising Practices Report, which really focuses on the cultural differences within disciplines where, for instance, in medicine, there's more of a hustle culture where you shouldn't ever be sick and you're so expected to come to work versus, say, other hard science cultures, which is there's an emphasis on exceptional individuals and brilliance, and so teeing certain people up and not including others. So it comes down to culture and leadership and really really getting our leaders of these various units in, say, the Department of Energy, for instance, to recognize the importance of inclusivity, of their leadership style. Just going back to Sarah's points that she highlighted, critically important that leaders can change a lot of this, but certainly grassroots can bring attention to it.
Can I jump
Go
in
ahead, Sarah.
briefly on that? This question of the competitive landscape in research, I like to joke that what we're dealing with now is not your father and mother's Office of Science. You know, and I'm sure that's true for all the funding parts of DOE and across the federal government. It's just more complicated, and the money comes in smaller buckets with more expectations, and every little bit of money you have to go for has the same overhead. So I ask my staff, and I'm asking my leaders in my center, what are we building? What are we trying to do? How can we be more strategic? And just because we can respond to a funding opportunity announcement does not mean we should, because you spinning up some new capability by yourself in that lab, how sustainable is that going to be? It might pay your salary for a little while, but it's not really going to help you build something that will really thrive in today's world. And these are not popular conversations because there's a tension between top-down leadership managing research, which everyone hates, and bottoms-up entrepreneurialism. And I love creative people and I want that to thrive. But we also have to be prudent about what we really can sustainably support at my lab or in my section of the lab versus figuring out how we can be tremendous partners on an activity that another lab is leading or another PI is leading at academia. So that's why a lot of my emphasis was on how do we work with each other and how do we understand how to be really creative scientists while working with other people so that we can get the great work done, but I don't have to be the rock star PI and everything. So it's a challenge. It's absolutely a challenge, but this is the world we're in.
So I absolutely love this, thinking about the sort of strategic thinking in this space versus entrepreneurial thinking in this space, which I don't think are contradictory processes, but I do think that they sometimes comes to head if you're always seeking to do everything in order to succeed. I also think that there's a sort of a realm of what are we rewarding in our system, and what are we recognizing as being contributing, right? Is it just how many different grants are we getting, or how much money are we bringing in versus how well are we doing that research, or how are we actually supporting the other members of our lab in the mentorship or other aspects? How well are we aligned with the mission that we've been told to represent or to engage? Whether that's at an academic institution, the mission of the university, or the mission of a lab, I think is really important to consider as we move forward.
Yeah, I want to sort of build upon Dr. Higginbotham and others. You know, we're talking about capacity building, right? And so I use the sort of ecology model. So we have our institutions, and as Dr. Higginbotham said, leaders have a huge role to play, especially vis-a-vis the discussions about reward systems, right? Especially let's, for example, say universities, which I'm most familiar with, RP&T. Is that going to recognize service in service of diversity and inclusion, in mentorship, et cetera, in ways it recognizes other areas? Funding agencies. So you go up from the institutions, NIH now, and some other institutions are looking at quality of mentorship and mentorship capacity, for example, in training grants. So I think it's the idea, I love the idea of not just looking institutionally, but cross-institutionally. Our disciplinary societies also have a really big role to play in terms of sort of normalizing these conversations and these new priorities. So that's what I have to add.
Thank you so much. Victoria, maybe if you can step in and ask the next.
Sorry, as I'm on mute. Okay, so we have a question from a lab staff. The question is, I can report many of the harassment and bullying incidents, including immediately pre-pandemic, have been perpetrated by visiting university users. How can labs manage this problem across these different communities? And can the DOE labs play a unique, significant role in changing values in our research sector?
Wow. So as the lab person on the panel, I'll take a swing at that one. That's a really tough one. When we have users or visitors come into our labs, we have them take training. So they cannot go in a lab without understanding and agreeing to follow all of our safety procedures. And if you don't, we ask you to not come in anymore. We would include security where appropriate. Certainly we talk about protecting information and property that's belongs to our lab, right? So we do have some structure there. Misbehaviors, that's a little bit trickier one, and I'd have to think about it. My guess is that there could be some process created, but that's a challenge. I don't know is there anybody online from DOE here? Because I'd love to hear their perspectives on that. What they would be okay with us doing. If you've got somebody who comes in and is documented really poor behaving, nobody needs that. And it's not going to lead to great science. So we'd have to figure out how to handle that. But there should be a responsible leader in the vicinity for any facility at DOE. And so we've got to work through the leadership structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
An interesting thing just occurred to me about maybe an analogy, and this is something maybe how the labs, again, I'm not a part of you, could think about. We know obviously that individual researchers are being kept off of panels, review panels, et cetera, if their home institutions have found them to violate sexual assault and harassment policies, et cetera. So I wonder if there's a way labs could partner with with institutions more broadly and be able to somehow know if that's the case. That doesn't take care of someone is behaving badly for the first time in their work at the lab. But I just thought that's just an idea I had.
So I'm over here desperately looking at our institutional websites, because at the National Academies, we support a unit called the Action Collaborative on Prevention of Sexual Harassment in Higher Education. And I believe that one of the DOE labs is actually a member of the Action Collaborative. And I'm pretty sure that it's Argonne that's a member. And through Argonne, I believe there's also now a connection to the other labs where we are engaging and facilitating some of the practices that are being developed by the other 62 member institutions, and can collaborate and learn from each other, and then learn about what's going on at the lab space. So that sort of conversation can help figure out what are some ways that we can prevent these same sort of horrible instances where you have individuals who are temporary users in your space coming in. This is also a phenomenon that is seen actually in medical centers as well, where some of the harassment is coming from patients or other individuals who are temporarily within this space, rather than long-term users. And you don't have a way to sort of maintain or provide training, but you still have the impacts of that harassment happening to your staff and to your colleagues. So this is a very particular thing to be facing within the lab structure. So apologies that I don't know more about that in particular, but I do know that they are members of the Action Collaborative. And so I'm hoping that through this, it's a 4-year initiative, there will be more conversations and more learning that's being taking place. That, by the way, is based off the National Academy's report that focuses on the prevention of sexual harassment of women in sciences.
Thank you. So just take a couple more minutes. I have one more question that I'm going to combine a few questions about this concept of increased partnerships and rotations across the laboratories. You know, there's a few systemic barriers to this, one being, you know, portability of benefits, and then family is another big challenge. Do you see an opportunity, you know, I think you cover the benefits one if you remain an employee of your original institution and keep it relatively short. Would it be possible, given this, greater emphasis on telework, could we even remove the necessity to move at all and just have that person, maybe visit once a month during their tenure at the other lab, but stay at home for the duration?
I think we need to be flexible and just think different, okay? I do believe, though, there's huge value in hanging out at a lab. And the face-to-face, the downtime, the informal stuff is different when it's 3D versus 2D. And if you don't know somebody, it's really hard to read the body language. You may think you are, but you probably aren't. And it's also exhausting to look at screens all day long. And that it takes a toll. And I think some of it is scientific creativity as well. We played all sorts of crazy ideas in our Oppenheimer program. What if we just had one employer and all the labs worked for that one employer? And then we all laughed a whole bunch because that just blows your mind. But what can we do to recognize this world is really different than 25, 50, 75, 95 years ago when some of these labs were stood up. So, remote work has changed a lot. Has it changed enough? I don't know, but I think we got to try. We got to lean into it.
I don't want to extend this, I know that we're at time, but I do want to encourage as people are thinking about how to engage their workplaces as we move forward to really look at the literature in this space. There is research about virtual collaboration, in-person collaboration, creativity that is engaged with both. There was a really thoughtful New York Times piece that came out last week actually about this. And I think it's really important that, there's a lot of assumptions that gets made when people are making these decisions. And there's a lot of research out there that can be relied on to actually inform these decisions. And don't get me wrong, I miss my walk into work. I miss seeing my colleagues in person. But I think people have found great ways to maintain their collaboration, to maintain their creativity. And there's some indication that it's actually can be more inclusive if you provide people the choice about their working engagement rather than enforcing one way or the other.
That was a fantastic plug for our next workshop, which we're still forming, but we are hoping to focus on collaboration and, particularly in this new virtual environment, how can we accomplish it effectively? So thank you very much for that, Maria. Well, we are over time. I'm so appreciative to all our panelists. I thought this was just so informative and insightful, and I really appreciate your time. And I know that all of our attendees did as well. I will follow up afterwards with email with the recordings and presentations and all the links that you all shared. So don't worry if you didn't get anything down. But one last question for Sarah is whether you could share the think pieces with Carolyn Tomczyk. I'm not sure if she's from one of the labs, but we can follow up afterwards with that.
Yeah, we'll follow up. The intention is to do so. They need to get through all the reviews, et cetera.
Excellent. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you all and have a great rest of your day. Oh, Steve.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.